Hey guys, tonight we're not sinking into a velvet fainting couch or peeking into Victorian scandals. No, tonight we're trudging barefoot across cold moss in a smoky Viking longhouse, dragging your wool cloak and your last ounce of patience. You're married, you're miserable, and honestly, you're one soggy boot away from declaring enough is enough. Your husband has just returned from trading downriver. His boots are muddy. His breath smells like fermented fish, and he hasn't said two words to you that aren't about the sheep pen. You stir the stew in silence, and the fire cracks. Somewhere deep in your bones, something ancient stirs. A decision. You're not stuck. Not in this world. Because in the Viking Age, when it comes to ending a marriage, the path, while not always easy, is surprisingly clear. You probably won't survive this. Of course. You might trip over your hem while marching out, or catch pneumonia from the sea breeze on your way to your brother's longhouse. But if you do survive, if you play your cards right, you could walk away from your husband, your marriage, and everything that doesn't serve you, and still keep your goats. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your local time and location in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a Viking woman now, and you're not as powerless as your modern brain might assume. Your clothes are heavy with damp wool. Your hands are rough from milking, salt and fish, weaving, and maybe the occasional whack with a staff to get unruly farmhands back in line. You're no dainty damsel. You're part of a world where survival means shared labor and shared responsibilities, including emotional ones. Marriages in Viking society weren't sealed with tender vows under cherry blossoms. They were practical arrangements, economic alliances, political chess moves disguised as wedding feasts. You married for land, for peace between feuding families, for cows, and the possibility of strong sons. Love might come later, if you were lucky. But here's the kicker. Those same practical motives meant there was room to be done with it. A bad marriage was more than just emotionally draining. It could be a threat to your survival, your family's standing, or your household's productivity. And Viking society, ever pragmatic, had mechanisms to handle that. In Norse law, especially in Iceland and Norway, a woman could initiate divorce just as easily as a man, sometimes even more convincingly. You didn't need a judge, a scribe, or 12 angry bearded jurors. You needed your voice, your witnesses, and your courage. Historians still argue whether this legal equality was widespread across all Norse regions, or mostly preserved in Icelandic texts. But one thing is clear, Viking women weren't legally invisible. You'd stand at the threshold of your shared home, the longhouse with its smoky rafters and drafty walls, and declare your separation publicly. If you wanted to make it really official, you might say it at the front door, then again in the bed you once shared. Yes, that bed. Very symbolic. Very awkward. This two-step announcement wasn't just for dramatic effect. It had legal force. And guess what? No one could stop you. If your husband got violent, that was another case entirely, one that could backfire on him. If he cheated, if he was lazy, if he squandered your dowry or insulted your honor, those were all reasons to walk. Even if none of that applied, you could simply say, "I'm done," and that would be enough. It's almost refreshing, isn't it? Compare that to the centuries that followed, where divorce was a labyrinth of shame, court battles, and ecclesiastical no-nos. But here, in this raw world of fjords and frostbite, A woman's right to exit a marriage was as real as her right to own land. Speaking of land, you probably brought some into this marriage, maybe a dowry of fields, jewelry, or livestock. In most cases, you'd take it back. Some sagas even suggest that if your husband had added wealth to your dowry, maybe as a kind of marital bonus, you kept that too. Not bad for a breakup bonus, right? Still, divorce wasn't easy, just legal. Your clan might disapprove. Your husband's family might threaten you. There could be rumors, but nobody could argue you didn't have the right. And people did it, often enough that the law had rules about it. There's even a record in the Sagas, an Icelandic law code, detailing how to walk away from your marriage with dignity, legality, and hopefully your favorite combs. The fringe tidbit: some sources suggest that if you said the divorce announcement incorrectly, messed up the script, said it in the wrong place, it might not count. Divorce law had theatrical elements. Miss your line? You're still married. Of course. We have to admit, most of these records were written by men, often centuries later. Sagas are storytelling devices, not courtroom transcripts. So historians still debate how common these divorces really were. Were they mostly elite women who had the freedom and backing to leave? Was it rare in isolated, rural areas? Still, the presence of these stories, dozens of them, with fierce women walking out and never looking back, says something. Something powerful. So now, picture yourself again. You're at the edge of the threshold. The fire crackles behind you. You've said the words. A neighbor woman stands nearby, nodding, serving as your witness. You gather your few things, wrap your cloak tight, and step into the cold. You're no longer a wife. You're free. You walk away from the longhouse with your breath visible in the frosty air and your heart beating harder than when you first said the words. It feels like a small battle, maybe even a victory, but no one claps. No one sings songs. There's no parade for a woman who just divorced her husband. Still, you're not afraid. Not exactly. Because in the Viking world, walking away doesn't make you a pariah. This wasn't your typical till death do us part kind of society. Viking marriage was never designed to be unbreakable. It was a social contract, almost transactional, and everyone understood that. If it broke, so be it. Life was already filled with uncertainty. Long voyages, feuds, frost, childbirth, and the occasional plague or raid. One more ending wasn't going to crack the sky. So, what did marriage mean back then? Well, first, it wasn't very romantic. Sure, there were weddings with feasting and ale, and definitely some slightly off-key harp music. But the purpose of marriage was to unite families, merge property, secure alliances, and, let's be honest, create more Vikings, preferably strong, healthy, axe-wielding ones. Most couples didn't choose each other. Your father or male guardian arranged it. Your mother might have helped scout for a respectable match. She knew which farmsteads were prosperous, which sons were sober, but ultimately, you were part of a clan strategy. You could say no, sure, but only if you had a very good reason. And even then, you might get overruled. Still, once married, you weren't just a decorative wife warming the bench. Viking women had responsibilities. You managed the household, ran the farm when the men sailed off, controlled the pantry keys, and dealt with servants or thralls. You might also be spinning wool, baking bread, making cheese, and occasionally handling legal matters. Basically, you were the CEO of your household, with an apron and a blade tucked in your belt, which made divorce all the more possible. You weren't dependent. You could return to your kin. You could run a farm. You could even marry again, and in many cases, you did. Historians still debate how often women initiated divorces compared to men. The law says they could, but was it frequent? Or was it mostly written in as a right that few could afford to exercise without consequences? That's the murky part. We know enough stories, though, to be sure that some women did stand up, speak out, and step away, and when they did, they weren't always scorned. Take, for example, the tale of Thorgerd Egilsdottir. She's no passive bystander. In the sagas, she's fierce, eloquent, strategic, a woman who tells her own husband to man up and avenge their son, or she'll divorce him for being unworthy. Divorce wasn't just an escape hatch, it could be a threat, a bargaining chip, a declaration of standards. There was a formula to marriage, and to ending one. Typically, there were two kinds of unions: betrothal marriages, set up with formal negotiations, gifts, and contracts, and handfast or less formal marriages, which may have involved fewer rituals and more impulsive behavior. The more formal the union, the more legally complex the divorce. But even in the simplest cases, divorce required a public declaration, the return of property, and usually some form of community knowledge. You couldn't sneak off in the night and call it done. Which brings us to something you didn't expect. Shame was surprisingly not baked into the Viking idea of divorce. Unlike in later Christianized societies, where a divorced woman might be viewed as damaged goods or morally suspect. Viking culture had no universal stigma about it. Your reputation didn't necessarily suffer just because your marriage didn't work out. What mattered was how you left. Did you follow the rules? Did you return the gifts? Did you make a scene? Or worse, did you not make enough of a scene? You see, Viking law prized clarity. If you were going to sever a social bond, it needed to be loud, legal, and witnessed. Whispered walkouts weren't acceptable. That's why you had to make your declaration at the front door and sometimes on the marital bed. That's why, in some regions, you had to repeat it 3 times, on 3 separate occasions, in front of different people. It wasn't just for the drama, though that certainly didn't hurt. It was to make sure there were no misunderstandings. Because once a woman walked out, took her keys, and said the words aloud, the property division clock started ticking. Let's talk about that for a second. A woman's dowry, heimanfylgja, went with her into marriage. It might include livestock, tools, household goods, or land rights. But the husband was also expected to contribute a morgungifu, a mourning gift given the day after the wedding, which legally became hers. That's right, you got a parting present before you even asked for one. When divorce happened, the woman kept her dowry and her mourning gift. If the man had misused her assets or failed to return them, he could face legal trouble. Sometimes, even physical retaliation from her male relatives. Marriage wasn't sacred, but contracts were. One fringe tidbit? Some sagas imply that if a man tried to stop a woman from leaving by physically restraining her, she could curse him, and those curses had legal weight. That's right. Viking courts might not care about emotional abuse, but a well-placed curse? That could get you witnesses and restitution. So now, here you are, newly unmarried. You've just crossed the legal finish line with your cloak, your goats, and your combs intact. You're not disgraced. You're not ruined. You're available. And Viking men? Well, they didn't seem too shy about marrying a woman who'd walked away once. In fact, Some of them saw it as a sign of strength. But before you start picking your next husband like apples at the market, maybe take a moment to enjoy the freedom. After all, it's not every day you get to rewrite your story with no one stopping you. You're back at your family's longhouse now, tired, windswept, but strangely calm. You sit near the hearth, warming your feet on the stone floor, and your sister pours you a mug of sour beer. No one asks what happened. They already know. The quiet nods from the women, the side eyes from the men, they all say the same thing. She left. She had her reasons. That's all you really need. Because in this world, a woman's reasons aren't always challenged. Not legally. Anyway. If you made your announcements properly and walked away with your dowry intact, the community doesn't interrogate your motives. They might speculate. Sure. Was he lazy? Did he cheat? Did he forget to salt the fish and ruin your winter stores? But the law doesn't demand your heartbreak be proven, just your process. And the process? It's elegantly simple. Step 1. You pack your things. Not everything, just what's yours. The keys to the pantry, the jewelry your grandmother passed down, that beautifully carved spindle no one else touches. You're not looting the house. You're reclaiming your legal property. Step 2. You step outside and speak. Loudly. In some regions, you recite the formula once at the front threshold and once in the marital bed. In others, it's done 3 times, like casting off a curse. You declare the marriage dissolved. You name your reasons. Cruelty, infidelity, laziness, or just unsuitability. And that's it. Witnesses are recommended. The more public, the better. Because while the law backs you, people can be trickier. Historians still argue whether these walkouts were more common in Iceland, where law codes like Gragos give them detailed attention, or if women in other Norse territories had equal rights. But the recorded rituals suggest a society that values procedure and isn't afraid of women who speak. And you speak beautifully. Some even sang it, or chanted it like a spell, not because they were witches, though let's be honest, a good half of them were herbalists with suspiciously wise eyes, but because spoken words carried power. A well-phrased divorce announcement wasn't just legal, it was magical. It reshaped your place in the world, which makes sense. This was a society where oaths could bind land, curse bloodlines, or win court cases. Language mattered, especially at thresholds, those liminal spaces where one life ends and another begins. There's a lot of threshold lore in Viking culture. Doors, steps, entryways. They show up again and again in rituals, dreams, and laws. Standing at a threshold and declaring a separation isn't random. It's symbolic. You are stepping out of one world and into another. Of course, it's not all metaphors and poetry. There's the practical stuff too. Let's say your ex-husband contests your departure. Maybe he claims you took something that wasn't yours. Maybe he insists you didn't say the words properly. Maybe he just wants to make your life difficult out of spite. That's where witnesses become crucial. They're not just your backup. They're your legal armor. If at least 2 people can verify that you declared your divorce publicly, your case is nearly bulletproof. Or, well, spear-proof. This is the Viking Age, after all. But here's a quirky little detail. If you don't make the announcement properly, your divorce might not count. And that could come back to bite you in the worst way. Like, say, your ex remarries, and then accuses you of bigamy because the first split wasn't official. Imagine explaining that to your village priest, assuming your region has one yet. Oh, and don't forget the return gifts. Some marriage contracts included reciprocal dowries, gifts from the husband's family to yours. Depending on the region and the arrangement, these might have to be returned after divorce, or not. Some women got to keep the entire bundle, especially if they could prove misconduct on the man's part, and if children were involved, that's another layer of complexity, but we'll get to that in a later section. For now, you're just enjoying the silence of not having to listen to someone snore through your storytelling. You run your fingers along the edge of your cloak, worn smooth from travel. You remember how your mother told you once, whispered, really, that divorce wasn't shameful, just serious, like taking down a thatched roof. You didn't do it lightly, but sometimes it had to be done, because rotten beams lead to collapse, and sometimes you have to start over. She divorced too, you know, long ago, before you were born. It wasn't talked about much, but the proof is in how confidently she walks, how easily she commands the food stores, how no man dares speak over her at the spring moot. So now here you are, following that path, alone, but not isolated, vulnerable, but not powerless. You have your skills, you have your name, you have your freedom. The fringe tidbit here: in some sagas, women who divorced were even more desirable afterward, not because they were young or fertile, but because they'd proven themselves savvy, capable, manageable, in the best Viking sense of the word, which usually means able to keep the goats alive and fend off raiders. So when you finish your mug of beer, your sister raises her eyebrows and says, "So, what next?" And you smile, because you have choices. You can go live with your aunt. You can remarry, if you want to. You can manage your own holding, maybe with a few thralls and a cranky goat named Frecky. Or you can just rest. No shame, no scandal, no scarlet letter stitched into your cloak, just a life that's yours again, and a door you closed all by yourself. You've rested, you've eaten, and the longhouse is quiet. The fire has burned down to glowing embers. You're lying on a straw mattress that doesn't belong to anyone but you now, and in the silence, you realize something else. The hardest part isn't walking away, it's being heard. And in Viking society, being heard was built into the system. To make your divorce valid, it wasn't enough to feel done. You had to say it, loudly, publicly, in a ritual that was equal parts legal formality and social theater. You stood on the threshold, or sometimes even in the bed you once shared. Yes, that same lumpy wool-stuffed platform you both snored on, and announced your departure. You declared your husband's faults. He was violent, or idle, or insulted you in public. Or, if you were being strategic, you kept it vague. We are no longer suitable. Then you said the magic words, "I divorce you," or the Norse equivalent, phrased precisely, like you were reading from a script passed down by generations of angry but eloquent wives. The law codes, especially the Icelandic Gragas, were very clear about this process. Miss a step, and you might still be legally married. Mess up the phrasing, and suddenly your goat farmer ex has legal claim to your morning gift. It wasn't just personal, it was procedural. Divorce was a performance, and your voice was your legal document. And honestly, that's kind of powerful, because while later Christian Europe would clamp down on women's autonomy with vows and virtue, Viking society allowed room for exit. Not always kindly, and certainly not without judgment, but with structure. Historians still argue whether these public declarations were meant to protect women or to control them. Did the law value female autonomy, or did it just want things done in a way the community could manage? Either way, the outcome was the same. A woman had a path. It wasn't easy, but it existed. And the sheer drama of it. Don't you love it? Imagine your neighbor Gudrun standing at her longhouse door, cloak blowing in the wind, calling out her grievances for all to hear. Her husband, Bjorn, red-faced and sputtering, standing inside the doorway with a carved wooden spoon still in his hand, trying to pretend the stew didn't just go cold. Or the woman in Laxdela Saga, yes, that Gudrun, who famously had 4 husbands and divorced 3 of them. She was brilliant, calculating, and had enough sharp retorts to make a scald blush. In one memorable scene, she tells her husband she's leaving him because he's too silent and aloof, too quiet, of all things. Some scholars say she was a proto-feminist. Others think she was just tired of guessing what her husband wanted for dinner. And there were rules, even for this spectacle. In some regions, the woman had to repeat her announcement at specific times, once when she decided, once the next morning, and once at a community gathering. It wasn't unlike canceling a lease. You had to give notice. And, if you gave it properly, your rights held up. But here's the fringe detail. Some sagas hint that if a woman declared her divorce without enough witnesses, or in the wrong location, it might count as slander. That's right, if you weren't careful, your breakup speech could backfire into a defamation lawsuit. Talk about high-stakes performance art. Still, most women followed the script, and not because they were desperate to leave. Sometimes, it was just strategic. Divorce in the Viking Age could be a way to reposition yourself, marry better, move house, or distance yourself from a brewing family feud. That's why some women, after divorcing, didn't retreat into spinsterhood. They remarried, quickly, and often up the social ladder, which makes you think maybe the whole walk away in shame trope is a much later invention. Because right now, you're watching yourself walk toward something, not just away. You're stepping into a space where your voice has legal weight, where your words can realign property, redirect alliances, and reframe your story. That's not a retreat. That's a pivot. And don't forget, Viking women weren't just wives. They were landowners, merchants, priestesses, seers. They hosted feasts, managed estates, even rode into battle in a few rare, saga-saturated cases. Divorce didn't erase those roles. If anything, it sharpened them. So let's say you've made your speech, you've packed your belongings, you've got your keys jangling on your belt, and your head held high. You're technically single now, or, more accurately, a logrija, a woman who has parted from her husband. And you feel... what? Powerful? Scared? Free? All of it? But before you settle into your new life, there's a little detail to handle. Redistribution of property. And here's where it gets complicated. Because Viking society, for all its boldness, loved an itemized list. There were laws about who kept the sheep, who returned the silver arm rings, and how to divide spoils. Some of this was predetermined in the marriage contract. Other parts, negotiated, or fought over, or, in especially juicy sagas, just stolen in the dead of night with the help of your brother-in-law who owed you a favor. But we'll talk goats and dowries later. For now, you've done the thing most people fear. You stood in public, broke a binding contract, and walked away with your chin up. And that's a story your grandchildren will whisper about, whether they admit it or not. Your goats are bleeding. That's how this new chapter begins, with livestock disputes and the realization that being free doesn't mean being finished. Divorce in Viking society may be legal, but it's not like waving a magic wand. There are still embers to rake through, spoons to count, and, yes, goats to divide. Because property division after a Viking divorce isn't a guessing game. It's a legal ritual with its own rhythms, just like the wedding feast that started this whole mess. Remember your dowry? That's yours to keep. It came with you into the marriage, and it goes out with you, unless something shady happened along the way. The same goes for the Morgan Gifu, that morning gift your husband was supposed to give the day after your wedding night. A land plot, some silver coins, maybe a sword, something symbolic, something substantial. That too, yours. But what about the combs, the milk cow with the white patch, the expensive wool cloak that your now ex claims he technically paid for, even though your aunt clearly gave it to you? Welcome to the goats and goods phase of your divorce. And yes, there are rules. Norse legal codes, like Gragos in Iceland and Galathing law in Norway, laid out how property was to be split when a marriage ended. If the couple had children, joint property was often held for their inheritance. If not, it got messy. Fast. The basic idea? You leave with what you brought. Anything earned or gained jointly had to be divided or contested. Historians still debate how formalized this process was. Some say couples worked it out on their own, with family mediation. Others argue that disputes were brought before local law courts or even moots. It likely varied from region to region, and from one dramatic saga character to the next. Let's take an example. A woman named Un the Deep-Minded, yes, that's actually how she's remembered, was a powerful matriarch who led her family across the sea after her husband died. But before that, she managed land, made deals, and commanded loyalty. Would she have hesitated to call out a cheating husband and demand her silver back? Absolutely not. And in some readings of her saga, she may have done exactly that. There's even a case of a woman who, upon divorce, demanded not only the return of her dowry and gift, but interest, claiming her husband had profited off her land and owed her the difference. The records are fuzzy on how that turned out, but we can all agree she deserves a horn of mead for effort. Back to you. You're sitting with your brother and two elders, listing out items from your marriage chest. Your ex is across the room, arms folded, muttering about the tools you took that he definitely forged himself. You keep your tone even, calm. You brought those tools into the house. They're yours. And behind you, your sister whispers, "Don't forget the amber necklace. Grandmothers, see, you're not alone. Divorce may put you on edge socially, but it doesn't erase your support system. Your kin matters. Your people matter. And they will step in, especially when the stakes involve family heirlooms and that incredibly valuable iron cooking pot. Now, not every divorce is this civil. Sometimes, one party storms off and takes everything that isn't nailed down, including the beeswax and the servant girl. In those cases, you might have to go to court or threaten to. Viking courts weren't grand halls with judges in wigs. They were open-air assemblies where disputes were argued before neighbors, chieftains, and a few over-interested goats. If your ex wronged you, you could seek compensation, vergild, in some cases, a kind of legal price for offenses, including, in certain regions, wrongful withholding of dowry. It's all wonderfully complicated. But the point is this: property mattered, not because Vikings were greedy, but because possessions were tied to identity. Your dowry wasn't just a pile of stuff. It represented your family's honor, your household tools, your ability to survive, your jewelry, a symbol of your role. So when a woman claimed her combs or her spindle or her share of the livestock, she wasn't being petty. She was asserting herself in a world that recognized property as power. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some cases, pets were included in the divorce tally. One saga hints at a woman demanding return of a particularly well-trained hunting dog. The husband refused. The dog went missing shortly after. No one ever proved who took it. But let's just say no one asked too many questions, either. You end the day exhausted but satisfied. Your side of the ledger is balanced. Your keys hang heavy on your belt again, just like before. You've reclaimed not just your things, but your role. No longer one half of a marriage. A full, legal person again. And maybe the best part? You didn't need anyone's permission. Not your husband's. Not a priest's. Not even the local chieftain's. You spoke, you acted, and you endured. The law supported you. The gods didn't strike you down. And your goats are still bleeding. Probably in agreement. Tomorrow, you'll decide where to go next. But tonight, you've done something most women in history couldn't. You've walked away with your dignity and your property intact. The goats are settling down. Your brother has stopped fuming about the broken ladle your ex insisted was family property. And you finally got a moment to breathe. It's quiet here, just the low hush of wind against timber, the sigh of that one drafty beam above the hearth, and the faintest hint of smoke in the air. Divorce may be legal, but it's also lonely. And that's where things get interesting. Because now that you're free, what do you do with it? In Viking society, divorce wasn't just about escape. It was often about strategy. You weren't just running away from something. You might very well be angling for something better. Sometimes that meant survival. Sometimes it meant love. And sometimes it meant securing a better deal on firewood. Let's not pretend romance was always the motivation. Your cousin Ragna, for instance, famously left her second husband because he refused to share his timber pile during a harsh winter. The saga says she marched across the ice, cloak billowing like a ship's sail, and declared the marriage void on account of insufficient warmth. It sounds petty now, but when your toes might literally fall off, firewood becomes romantic currency. That's the point. Freedom meant choices, and Viking women, despite the raiding and saga-sized chaos, had some choice in what came next. Now, you might expect to be a social outcast after divorce, shunned, gossiped about, or quietly ushered into some forgotten corner of society. But you'd be surprised. A divorced woman, if she handled things correctly, could be viewed not as a failure, but as a free agent, a woman who knew her rights, who wasn't afraid to use them. And in many cases, that made her even more attractive, not just for remarriage, but for alliances, business arrangements, even political moves. Historians still argue whether these women had true freedom or just traded one household for another, but the sagas paint some divorced women as surprisingly influential. They show up managing estates, representing themselves in court, or remarrying up the social ladder. Divorce didn't damage their status, it revealed their resilience. Take the case of Halgerd from Njal's saga. She's married 3 times, and while the first 2 end in murder, bit of a red flag. Yes, she's no victim. She navigates her relationships like a seasoned negotiator, sometimes manipulative, sometimes misunderstood, always aware of her leverage. Her divorces don't define her, they empower her. Though, to be fair, most historians agree she's someone you wouldn't want to borrow a loom from. And here's where things get quirky. Sometimes, divorce was a mutual strategy. Couples parted ways not because of scandal, but because it made economic or social sense. Maybe your husband wanted to marry into a different clan. Maybe you had a better offer. Maybe you were tired of sharing your cheese rations. One little known tidbit from the Sagas hints at a wife who divorced her husband because he was too obsessed with runes. Not magic ones, just boring ones. He spent all night carving them into wood, murmuring to himself, and never helped with the threshing. She cited neglect, and the community agreed. Neglect, by the way, was a legitimate reason for divorce. If a husband failed to provide, whether food, protection, or companionship, the wife had grounds to leave. And this wasn't just theoretical. Some law codes list failing to sleep in the marital bed for 3 years as grounds for separation. So yes, even ghosting had legal consequences in the 10th century. Now imagine your options. You've got your dowry, your tools, your dignity. Maybe your ex was a bore. Maybe he had wandering eyes. Maybe he just smelled like old onions. Whatever the reason, you're out, and people know it. What happens next depends on your network. Do you have family nearby? Allies? A good reputation? If so, you might remarry within the year, maybe even within the month. Some women had proposals lined up before the ashes of their last marriage were cold, not unlike today's dating apps, just with more oxen and fewer blurry selfies. And remarriage wasn't frowned upon. In fact, it was often encouraged. Viking society wasn't built for long-term singleness. Life was harsh. Homes needed running, fields needed tending, and alliances always needed refreshing. But here's where the real game begins. If you're smart, you don't just remarry, you upgrade. A man with more land, more cattle, more social pull, maybe a chieftain, or the widowed brother of your last husband, awkward, but not unheard of. Maybe even a traitor, if you don't mind the sea legs. Suddenly, your divorce isn't just a personal choice, it's a power move. You position yourself. You negotiate your dowry again. You set terms. Maybe this time, you add a clause about who keeps the beehives if things go south. Maybe you secure rights to a section of the field. Maybe, just maybe, you make it clear that the marital bed must contain at least one warm blanket and no rune-obsessed husbands. Because here's the thing. Viking women knew how to play the long game. You weren't waiting to be chosen. You were choosing. So tonight, as you sit by the fire, combing your hair and weighing your next move, you realize something profound. Your divorce wasn't an ending. It was an opening. The world hasn't shut you out. It's watching to see what you'll do next. And whatever that is, it's entirely up to you. So, let's say you do remarry, or maybe you don't. Maybe instead, you quietly slip back into life as a single woman, managing your household, tending to your sheep, brewing ale that's frankly better than anything your ex ever managed to ferment. Either way, the gossip travels faster than a longboat in fair wind, and that's how the rumors start. She traded husbands like tunics. I heard she walked out just because he snored. They say she was lent out. Ah, yes, the notorious whispers of Viking wife swapping. Let's untangle that knot, shall we? First, the facts. The Vikings were practical, sure, unsentimental, often. But libertines? Not exactly. What we know about their social structures suggests they valued clear rules, especially around property, honor, and lineage. So, where did this idea of wife swapping or wife lending come from? Well, some of it comes from sagas, which, let's be honest, are part soap opera, part courtroom drama, and part medieval clickbait. One saga in particular, Ljosvetninga Saga, references a man who loaned his wife to another man, temporarily, with conditions. It's all very strange, and scholars still argue whether the phrase was literal, symbolic, sarcastic, or simply bad translation. Some interpret these passages as acts of trust or honor, a man allowing a friend to share his house and wife during times of hardship. Others say it was just poetic shorthand for infidelity, or a legal setup for later drama. Either way, don't start thinking Viking marriages were ancient reality TV. If wife swapping did happen, it wasn't common, and it certainly wasn't codified. In fact, sleeping with someone else's wife, bed right violation, was a serious legal offense. The kind that involved hefty fines or very pointed spears. So why do these stories keep coming up? Because they're tantalizing. Because they confuse our modern moral code. And because the Vikings left just enough contradictory records to keep scholars debating across centuries and 5 academic conferences per year, one fringe theory? Some of these swaps were more like mock divorces, ways to avoid the church's growing restrictions on remarriage. You'd announce a divorce, move partners around, and then remarry someone new. Voila, legal workaround. And until Christianity arrived in full force, no priest was needed, but it wasn't all loopholes and liaisons. Honor still mattered. Reputation was currency, and a woman seen as too liberal with her affections might not find future matches so easily. There were boundaries, even in the fjords. And yet the idea that a woman could leave her husband and later choose a new one without being branded a harlot or cursed by the gods is revolutionary compared to many later European norms. Your own position, now divorced, reflects that subtle balance. You're free, but watched. Independent, but still part of a tight web of family, neighbors, and clan. If you choose to remarry, it must be done with care, not because of shame, but because of strategy. And here's where the law gets a little fuzzy. In some regions, multiple marriages were common, not all at once. This wasn't that kind of Viking drama. But sequentially, a woman might marry 3, even 4 times in her life, especially if she outlived her husbands, which, let's be honest, many women did. War, travel, disease, angry neighbors. It was a tough world for husbands, and divorced women weren't necessarily excluded from the marriage market. In fact, they were sometimes preferred, older, wiser, dowry already sorted, with no illusions about the romance of sharing a chamber pot. What's not to love? The real caution came down to lineage. If a woman had children from her first marriage, the new husband had to consider inheritance laws. Who owned what? Who stood to gain from whom? Viking laws around inheritance were complicated, and blended families brought blended legal headaches. Still, the path remained open. You could be divorced and still manage land, still raise children, still be invited to feasts, and hold influence. Still, if you played your cards right, be remembered in a saga. There's even a story of a woman named Thorgerder who divorced twice, married a successful merchant, and later financed the construction of a harbor that bore her name. She wasn't a footnote. She was the architect of her legacy, and no one seemed to mind that she had other last names before that one. So now you, sitting here with a steaming bowl of porridge and a half-cleaned cloak, realize something else. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to justify your departure. defend your silence, or parade your loneliness around like a badge. You did what needed to be done. You walked out when the fire went cold. You claimed your freedom, not because you're reckless, but because you're reasonable. And if they call it wife swapping, let them whisper. You know the truth. This wasn't scandal. This was survival. You start to notice it now, how people look at you in the market, not with scorn, not exactly with pity, but with a kind of wary curiosity, as if you might speak your mind at any moment and declare someone unworthy of being your fishmonger. You are, after all, a woman who left her husband and survived it, in a land where storms sink ships and winter eats the weak. That is a kind of power. But you also notice the whispers that run deeper, quieter, whispers about the gods. Because in Viking society, gods aren't distant, silent deities sitting on clouds. They're loud, drunk, sometimes moody immortals who walk among humans, meddling in feuds, poking into love lives, and, if the sagas are to be believed, occasionally turning into animals for reasons no one ever fully explains. So what do the gods think of divorce? Well, that depends on who you ask. The sagas rarely depict the gods taking sides in mortal marriages, but that hasn't stopped generations from believing they might. Thor is said to value loyalty and courage, but he's also known to go off on his own for long stretches. Freya, goddess of love and beauty, has her own share of heartbreaks and flexible relationships. Odin? Let's not even start. That one-eyed wanderer is about as emotionally available as a fog bank. Still, religion colors everything. A few elders grumble that your marriage might have ended because you failed to make the proper offering at midsummer, that maybe your divorce has cursed your loom, or that the household gods, Landvetter, have turned their backs on you. You ignore them, mostly, because here's the quiet truth. Viking society is pragmatic. Yes, there are gods. Yes, there are omens and dreams, and runes carved into bones. But at the end of the day, when the firewood runs low, and the goat gives birth in a snowstorm, people care less about celestial opinions, and more about whether the roof leaks. Still, you leave offerings at the stones outside your home, just in case. Because the neighbors? Now they're the real gods of Viking society. They remember everything. Who borrowed flour and returned it? Who lied at the last moot? Who let their ox wander into someone else's barley field? And most importantly, who caused drama? Divorce doesn't automatically ruin your standing, but it reshapes your reputation. You become someone to watch, not necessarily someone to scorn, but someone who defied expectation. A woman who didn't settle. A woman who acted. Historians still argue how much gossip affected legal standing in Norse communities. In theory, the laws were neutral. In practice, your social capital could be the difference between winning a case and being laughed at a court. And divorce was ripe territory for gossip. Was your ex abusive? Was he cursed? Did he make love like a dead fish? Not that anyone would say that out loud, but someone's probably whispering it near the smokehouse. If you left him for a better man, people will call you ambitious. If you remain single, they'll call you proud. If you go live with your cousin for a while, they'll start asking questions about him too. It's a bit like living in a village where everyone is part-time judge, part-time scald, and full-time tea spiller. But it's not all bad, because for every raised eyebrow, there's a nod of respect, quietly, at feasts or funerals or the spring moot. Other women might pull you aside, ask you how you did it, ask if you regret it, ask what it felt like to speak the words and walk away. And sometimes they'll tell you their stories in return, like the one who stayed with a man who drinks too much mead and forgets her name when he's angry, or the one who's been sleeping in the grain shed because her husband took a concubine into their bed. They want to leave, but they haven't yet. You become something unexpected, an example, a proof that it's possible, that there's a path, that the world doesn't end when the marriage does, which, in a society that values bravery above nearly everything else, is no small thing. The gods might be watching. The neighbors definitely are. But you're rebuilding. Maybe you've joined the weaving circle again, selling dyed wool for a few extra coins. Maybe you've taken over a small farmstead, or moved into your cousin's old stead when he left for Dublin. Maybe you've even started seeing someone new, a widower with kind eyes and fewer opinions about butter churning. Whatever path you've chosen, you carry your freedom like a shield, not raised, not defensive, just present. You've endured judgment, you've outlasted winter, you've survived the god's silence and the neighbor's noise. And now, you're still standing, with your name intact, and, if we're being honest, with better goats. The days are getting longer now. Spring pushes in like a curious child, peeking around the edges of snowbanks and melting the corners of everything. The mud is back, the smell of fish is back, and unfortunately, so is your ex-husband, at least his name, which someone casually drops over smoked trout at the market. Apparently, he's remarried, to a merchant's daughter, younger, quieter, allegedly better at managing pickled herring. You nod politely and move on. Because that doesn't matter anymore. But another name does start to come up. Yours. Because now people want to know why you left. They start speculating. They get nosy. And that means one thing in a Viking village. Your husband probably cheated, and the whole town is about to become very interested in the details. Infidelity was one of the few hard reasons for divorce that most legal codes agreed on. If your spouse cheated, especially publicly, you could call it quits. No further explanation required. And depending on the region, the cheating partner could lose their dowry share or face legal compensation. Some laws even allowed for a revenge clause. The wrong party could strike back once without consequence. Talk about a one-time coupon for vengeance. But, and here's the tricky part, cheating wasn't always easy to prove, especially if it happened quietly, especially if it involved thralls, enslaved people, who, legally, weren't considered on the same social level, and whose involvement often didn't count. Historians still debate the nuances here. Was sleeping with a concubine considered adultery? Did the law differentiate between casual dalliances and emotional betrayal? The sagas certainly don't help. They read like a cross between Judge Judy and medieval fan fiction. But for you, the betrayal was real. You may not have caught him in the act, but you saw the signs, the whispered conversations, the sudden generosity toward the neighbor's servant girl, the smugness, the smell. You'd like to say you left because of principle, but if you're honest, it was also because of the sheer audacity. Viking society may have tolerated many things: drunkenness, loud toasts, fish-based diets, but smugness? That's a crime of its own. So yes, infidelity played a part. You didn't have to prove it in court. You just had to say it at the threshold with the right witnesses, in the right tone. It gave your divorce a sharper edge, one people remembered, and maybe that's why you're becoming an icon? Okay, not quite a hero, but certainly a known quantity. People begin to treat you like someone who sees things clearly, who won't be fooled twice, and that gives you a strange new kind of power in a society where honor is half the currency and storytelling is the other half. You find that some women treat you like a quiet oracle. They bring you dried herbs and questions. How do you know he's cheating? What if I don't have proof? Just a feeling. What if he says I'm the one being cold? You don't have all the answers, but you do have one solid piece of wisdom. If your goats trust him less than they trust you, it's probably a sign. That gets a laugh. And more dried herbs. You also remember how the law worked in your favor, not just emotionally, but materially. Because in cases of confirmed infidelity, a woman could keep her full dowry. Sometimes she could even claim extra damages if her husband spent joint assets on his mistress. There's a case mentioned in Frostathing law, where a wife caught her husband giving her prized necklace to another woman. She not only ended the marriage, she sued him for theft, and won. The best part? She got the necklace back and then wore it to the next feast. Fringe tidbit? There's one saga that describes a woman leaving her husband while he was asleep, after making a public announcement outside the house at dawn. He woke up to find her gone, his possessions divided, and his reputation in tatters. It's said he tried to woo her back by sending her a dozen smoked eels and a poem. She sent the eels back, uncooked. Of course, Viking men could also initiate divorce for infidelity. The law cut both ways, but women often bore the social consequences more heavily. So for a woman to walk out and be believed meant her case was airtight, or her status was strong, or both. In your case, you had the receipts, figuratively, anyway. So here you are now, single, unbothered, and increasingly well-fed, because people keep inviting you to dinners where they ask things like, "Did he really leave his axe in her woodpile?" You just smile. Because if there's one upside to a society built on oral tradition, it's that you can become legend within your own lifetime. And besides, somewhere out there, your ex is probably struggling to keep up with the herring barrels and tripping over your old cat, the one you very deliberately left behind. You didn't just survive infidelity, you spun it into folklore. The days grow louder now. Chickens are fussing, merchants are shouting about wool prices, and somewhere in the distance, someone's definitely setting fire to a cooking pot. You're returning to the rhythm of village life, but something's changed. It's subtle, but you feel it. People greet you differently. You're no longer the woman who left. You're the woman who could. And with that comes curiosity, respect, and a few pointed questions about what your husband was really like, especially from other women, especially when the men are out hunting. But here's a surprising thing. Not all Viking divorces came from affairs or violence. Sometimes the issue was, well, aesthetic, or spiritual, or what we'd now call irreconcilable differences. Though in Norse terms, that might just mean your husband was too fancy. Yes, really. If your man wore silk too often, was obsessed with combing his hair, or took too many baths, seriously, he could be accused of being unmanly. Not because hygiene was frowned upon, Vikings were actually cleaner than most of their medieval peers, but because gender roles were sharply drawn, and being effeminate meant losing honor. So when a woman wanted out, she might cite her husband's manlazy, unmanliness. Maybe he refused to defend her in a feud. Maybe he dressed like a Saxon. Maybe he composed love poems when what she really needed was help butchering a seal. There's a passage in Grogos that makes this clear. A wife could end a marriage if her husband dressed too femininely, or if he didn't sleep in the same bed as her for 3 years. 3 years. That's less marriage and more awkward roommate arrangement. Historians still debate how often this clause was used versus how often it was just waved around during marital spats like a threatening ladle. But the message is clear. If a man failed to meet his side of the gender contract, a woman had options. And here's the best part. You didn't have to prove he was unmanly in a formal court. Just say it aloud, on the threshold, with witnesses. Of course, the consequences weren't always clean. Your ex might call you unreasonable, or cold, or cursed. He might claim you were the one who stopped sharing the bed, who started whispering to stones, who kept leaving sprigs of wormwood above the door like some kind of subtle hex. You don't deny it. Maybe you did. Maybe the wormwood was decorative. Maybe not. But even if he tried to shame you, the law didn't. A woman had the right to end a marriage for emotional neglect, for dishonor, or for violations of what we'd now call vibe agreements. And it went both ways. If a woman was considered Nightinger, dishonorable, her husband could also dissolve the union. If she cursed his family, committed adultery, refused intimacy, or, get this, mocked his masculinity in public, that was grounds for legal separation. That last one, it shows up in the sagas more than once. A sharp-tongued wife could wreck a man's reputation faster than a lost battle. One insult, well placed, and suddenly he's the man whose wife said he combs like a girl. Fringe tidbit: one woman supposedly divorced her husband because he couldn't grow a beard. No one knows if the story's true or just saga-level pettiness, but it made it into oral tradition, which, in Viking culture, is almost the same thing as law. You begin to realize these divorces weren't just about individual emotions. They were about status, yours and his. A marriage was a public alliance. A breakdown was a public shift. And calling out a partner's failings wasn't just catharsis, it was politics. You protected your honor by making sure the reason you walked away was known, understood, and, if possible, respected. You weren't petty. You were precise. And now, you feel freer than you have in years. No more navigating his moods. No more swallowing your words like cold porridge. No more pretending you don't mind the way he chews with his mouth open like a starving wolf. You even have more space now. Literally. You've moved into your aunt's small steading, a cozy, tidy place with a clear view of the fjord, and 0 unmanly tunics hanging by the hearth. You rehang your keys by the door. You plant herbs in neat rows. You finally get to burn that pair of wool socks he never washed. And slowly, the feeling creeps in. The feeling that you didn't just survive a divorce. You executed a strategy. You upheld your role in society by enforcing your limits. You proved to the village and to yourself that honor isn't just about staying. Sometimes, it's about leaving before the roof collapses. And now, you stand taller. Not because you're prideful, but because you've earned the right to. In a society that valued strength, wit, and follow-through, you ticked every box. Even if your ex now tells people you're difficult. Especially then. You're in the forest now, basket in hand, gathering wild herbs, wormwood for stomach aches, yarrow for wounds, maybe some cloudberries if the birds haven't gotten to them first. The light falls in slanted columns between the pine trunks, and for once, no one is asking you who you belong to. Because here's the truth. You belong to yourself. Still, it wasn't always that easy. For many women in Viking society, marriage could sour slowly, like milk left too long in a warm hall. And when that souring turned to something worse, cruelty, humiliation, even violence, the path out, while legally possible, wasn't always smooth. Let's talk about cruelty. Not every law code in the Norse world spelled out what we'd call domestic abuse, but many acknowledged neglect, dishonor, or physical harm as legitimate reasons for divorce, especially if the injury was public, repeated, or caused shame. That's the key. Shame. In this world, public reputation carried as much weight as private misery. A man might strike his wife in anger, but if word got around, if bruises were visible at the spring moot, or if she fled to her kin in the middle of the night, he'd face consequences, not just in his household, but in the eyes of the community. In fact, there's a clause in Icelandic law stating that if a man beat his wife so severely that she had to leave the home, and it was known, he could be punished for damaging her reputation. That's how deep the concept of honor ran. Even in harm, her standing mattered. Historians still argue how often this law was enforced. Was it really about protecting women, or just preserving clan alliances? Was it a tool for justice, or just a form of social damage control? But, in the sagas, we see flashes of reality. In Laxdæla Saga, there's a woman named Gudrun. Yes, another Gudrun. There are always 5 of them. She's smart, sharp-tongued, and survives 2 failed marriages. Her second husband, Thord, is said to have struck her once. Just once. But that's all it took. She left him immediately, invoked the law, and kept her dowry. No hesitation, no groveling, just a clean break, and the echo of her footsteps on the packed earth outside his door. You like her already. But what if the abuse isn't physical? What if it's emotional, dismissal, insults, isolation? In the Viking world, this gets murky. There's little evidence of a formal category for emotional cruelty, but women were still expected to be treated with respect. If a husband repeatedly embarrassed his wife in public, failed to protect her from harm, or tarnished her honor, she had options. Maybe she didn't always use the word abuse, but she could cite neglect, shame, or dishonor. And those were grounds enough. If her kin supported her claim, and especially if she had witnesses, her path to divorce was still legally valid. And remember, Viking women had kin. They had brothers, uncles, cousins, and often sisters. A woman rarely navigated these decisions alone. The sagas are filled with scenes of quiet counsel by the fire, of whispered strategy in the weaving room, of strong women reminding each other what their rights were and what they deserved. Quirky tidbit. There's a tale of one woman who trained her dogs to bark whenever her husband raised his voice. Eventually, he stopped shouting, possibly out of fear, possibly because the dogs also bit. Now, imagine yourself in this position. You've taken the legal route, you've spoken the words, you've walked away. But what happens after the abuse ends? That's where the healing begins. You wake in a bed you chose. You stir your own pot without fear that it will be judged too salty. You fix the thatch on your roof without anyone telling you that it's not a woman's job. You sit at the evening fire and breathe, not because there's nothing left to do, but because no one is yelling while you do it. There's a lightness to life now, a space. You visit the marketplace. Trade your herbs for dried fish or a bolt of dyed linen. You pass your ex on the road and he doesn't meet your eyes. Good. Others do. They nod, sometimes with a knowing look. One woman presses a dried flower into your palm. Another mentions she's thinking of leaving her own husband. She says it like a secret. You hold it like a torch, because even when the law is on your side, the road away from harm is dark. It takes bravery. And while bravery was expected from warriors and poets, it's something else entirely when it comes from a woman standing alone at the edge of her longhouse, keys in hand, speaking her truth into the wind. You didn't raise a sword, you raised your voice. And that's a saga worth remembering. The The sun sits low over the hills, spilling gold across your newly planted garden. The soil is soft, turned by your own hands. You press seeds into the earth and pause, just for a moment, to stretch your back. The ache reminds you, this life is yours now. But what about the children? Because divorce doesn't just mean separating lives. It means unraveling a household. And if there are children involved, things get far more complicated than who keeps the cheese press or that one nice iron kettle. In Viking society, children were not just beloved kin. They were assets, heirs, clan bridges, proof of alliances, and where they lived after a divorce could shift the balance of power between families. So, how was custody handled? Well, the law wasn't exactly a cozy parenting plan with alternating weekends and joint decisions about goat names. Custody often depended on a few key factors: age, gender, status, and inheritance. If a child was very young, they typically stayed with the mother, at least until they could walk and speak. After that, things got murky. Sons might be expected to live with their father to learn manly things, like how to swing a sword without slicing off their own toe. Daughters might stay with the mother to learn household management and how to keep the goats from chewing the laundry. But that wasn't a hard rule. Sometimes, the deciding factor was property. If the child stood to inherit land or livestock from one side of the family, they might be raised by that side to ensure the inheritance stayed in-house. It wasn't always about affection, it was about lineage. And here's the tricky bit. Viking society didn't just value the nuclear family. Kin mattered. Uncles, grandparents, cousins. They could all step in to raise a child, especially if a divorce caused tension between the parents, or if one household was considered unsafe or unworthy. Historians still argue how often women were awarded long-term custody. Some believe the norm leaned toward fathers, especially for boys. Others point to sagas where women clearly maintain full maternal authority and do just fine without a male counterpart looming in the doorway. In Njal's saga, we meet Bergthora, fierce and fearless, who raises her children with wisdom and fire, even as chaos burns around her. No one questions her right. Her children are hers. But that's the sagas. In daily life, the decision might be less grand and more gut-wrenching. Imagine the negotiations. Your ex offers to keep the boy, says he'll teach him how to sail, promises to take him to the next thing meeting will weigh. You argue that he's too young, that he's sickly, that he needs his mother. And behind you, your brother whispers, let them go for now. He'll come back when he's older. Maybe that's true, maybe not. And maybe, just maybe, the child gets a say. Quirky tidbit: some regions allowed children around the age of 12 to choose which parent to live with. It wasn't common, and it wasn't always honored, but it did exist. Imagine that moment, your son standing before two families, choosing between two worlds. Sounds like something out of a saga, because it is. And yet, even in all this tangle of property and politics, there was tenderness. Divorced parents weren't always enemies. Some cooperated, shared duties, exchanged children seasonally like trade goods. You take him for the summer, I'll have her for the harvest. Practical? Sure, but also oddly heartwarming, in a goat-scented kind of way. You, personally, you negotiated wisely. Your daughter lives with you, tending the goats and asking too many questions about herbs. Your son spends part of the year with your ex, reluctantly, but with the understanding that he's learning to row and not much else. You see them both. You send them things. a carved spoon, a woven belt, a note scratched on birch bark that says, "Don't trust your uncle's meat pies." The children adapt, because children always do, and so do you. It's not perfect. There are nights when you stare into the fire, wondering whether you made the right choice, whether your son will forget your lullabies, whether your daughter will grow up asking why you walked away. But then you remember, what would they learn if you hadn't? They'd learn silence, tension, how to tiptoe around slammed doors, how to press down their own voice until it disappears. Instead, they're learning something else, that freedom is possible, that dignity matters, that women too can choose. And someday, when your daughter marries, if she marries, you'll tell her exactly how to leave if she must, where to stand, what words to say, what to pack, and she'll know, without doubt, that it's not shameful to walk away. It's brave. The wind picks up again, fluttering the woolen curtains of your new stead, carrying with it the smell of pine smoke and distant salt. It's the kind of breeze that makes you want to wrap a cloak tighter, not just around your shoulders, but around your whole life. Because while the pain of leaving has passed, something else is stirring in the air. Possibility. You've heard the murmurs. That woman, yes, her. She left her husband, took her dowry, raised her goats, and then married a chieftain's cousin. Or maybe it was the blacksmith, or the flax merchant with too many rings and not enough teeth. Details shift depending on who's telling the story, but the point remains. Divorce wasn't the end of her ladder, it was the first rung of something higher. Welcome to the secret sport of Viking society, social climbing by strategic remarriage. You wouldn't call it that, of course. Too bold. But let's be honest, when your first husband forgets your name at a feast, and your second one greets you with a silver comb and 2 oxen, you start to understand the appeal. And Viking women did remarry, often, freely, especially if they were still of childbearing age or came with valuable land. Even widows, often assumed to slip into quiet old age, sometimes took new husbands with better holdings and more political clout. Divorced women, if anything, had proof of value. They demonstrated they could manage a household, raise children, navigate disputes. They knew the rhythms of running a stead, the subtleties of trade, and, perhaps most importantly, how to avoid marrying someone who snored like a dying walrus. Historians still debate how common this upward mobility was. Some say it was limited to elite women, chieftains' daughters, landowning widows, women with brothers in high places. Others argue that cleverness could go a long way, even for women of modest means. The sagas give us clues. In the saga of the people of Vatnsdal, a woman named Ranveig divorces her lazy husband and later marries a powerful man whose farm sits at the center of the district. She gains influence, throws legendary feasts, and becomes known as a wise elder whose words are almost law. The story doesn't focus on her first husband. He fades into the background like a wet cloak on a sunny day. Fringe tidbit: one saga hints at a woman who strategically refused remarriage offers, building her own household and slowly collecting influence through hospitality, matchmaking, and, oddly, cheese-making. By the time she died, travelers from 5 districts knew her name, and her cheese. So, how does this look for you? Well, you've received a few offers. There's the young farmer whose sheep keep escaping, but whose smile makes up for it. There's the merchant with hands too soft for your taste, but his silver is real, and his intentions seem clean. And there's the older widower with quiet eyes and a habit of leaving small carved trinkets near your door, not love notes, exactly, but something gentler, a signal. you're in no rush, because remarriage, while accepted, is a negotiation. First, there's the dowry reset. If you remarry, you bring your existing property, but new arrangements must be made. Your new husband might owe you a fresh Morgan Gifu, a mourning gift, and your kin will certainly expect some form of contract. They want this next one to be better. Then there's the question of children. Will your new husband raise your son as his own? Will your daughter inherit equally with his kin? Will you live on his land or stay on yours? These are not afterthoughts. These are the building blocks of legacy. You meet with your brother. He pulls out a bone-scratch tally and starts calculating cows, pasture rights, family alliances. It's not unromantic, it's real. And frankly, it's comforting to know you're not being swept into anything without a plan, because this time, you are doing the choosing. This time, there's no pressure from your father, no hurried negotiations over dried fish and wool bolts, no priest hovering with a bored expression and a pre-written blessing. This time, if you marry, it's because it suits you. Maybe you will. Maybe you'll choose the widower who knows when to speak and when not to, who lets you manage the farm accounts without blinking, who doesn't care that you were once someone else's wife. Or maybe you'll stay single, turn your small plot into a thriving stead, take in younger women who need shelter, teach them what you've learned, that divorce isn't shame, that love is an obligation, that freedom, once tasted, becomes part of the blood. You run your hand across the new thatch, tied down tight before last night's storm. You didn't need anyone to fix it, you just did it. Maybe that's the lesson. Remarriage isn't a rescue, it's a choice. And you're not just surviving anymore. You're building, not just a home, but a life. One that's fully yours. The morning mist rolls over your field like a second skin. And for once, there's no pressing need to chase chickens, haul firewood, or negotiate dowry terms with your brother while he pretends to know math. You take your time lighting the hearth, folding your cloak, braiding your hair. Because today, you're something rare in the Viking world, a single woman with options. And the village notices. Some speak plainly. You'll remarry, of course. Others are sneakier. Don't you get lonely at night? One man even said, you must miss having someone to carry the water, as if you hadn't spent the past year dragging buckets uphill like a slightly irritated ox. But you don't miss being married. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because post-divorce Viking life isn't exile. It's re-entry into society, into independence, into a new rhythm of living. You're not sitting around weeping over tapestries. You're active, present, capable, and slowly, people stop treating you like a recent divorcee. They start treating you like you. There's the weaver who invites you to trade patterns, the butcher who throws in a little extra lard because you're good at managing stews, the older women who begin to include you in their quiet circle of influence, those who know which cows are fertile, which children are ill, and which men should be avoided based on poor barley decisions. You find your footing because Viking society, for all its roughness, respects competence. A woman who manages a household alone, pays her taxes, participates at the thing, and still finds time to preserve enough berries for winter. She's not a tragedy. She's an asset, and the legal structure backs you up. There's no rule forcing a woman to remarry. No father or brother dragging you to the altar. No priest declaring you broken or used. The word widow or divorcee doesn't come with the stink of failure. It just means next chapter. Historians still argue whether Viking society was truly progressive or just comparatively less restrictive than the Christian norms that came later. But the lived reality in many parts of Iceland and Norway was clear. If you could prove you could survive on your own, you were left to do so, with dignity. There's even mention in Gragas of legal protections for women managing households without husbands. You could sue, be sued, make trade deals, host feasts. You weren't half a person. You were just a person. It's a far cry from the centuries that would follow, when women's rights narrowed like the eye of a needle, and freedom came with caveats and consequences. You remember your cousin, the one who moved south and married a merchant's son near the Christianized ports. She wrote once, her husband won't let her go to the market alone. She needs a priest's permission to write a will. Divorce? Not even an option. You still keep her letter, not as a warning, as a reminder that your life, hard as it is also wide with choices. So what do you do with them? Well, you run your own stead now. It's modest. The roof still leaks in one corner. Your only servant has a limp and a habit of eating all the pickled turnips. But it's yours. You decide what gets planted. You decide when to shear the sheep. You decide when to host a feast and when to sit in quiet. And when suitors come, and they do come, you listen. Politely. But you no longer evaluate them by charm or cheekbones or the shine of their axes. You ask different questions now. Will they respect your land rights? Will they let you manage your own accounts? Will they help build? Or just expect to inherit what's already been built? You're not being difficult. You're being precise. And if they balk, they can walk. There's a long road back to the fjord, and you're not in the business of rescuing someone else's fragile ego. Fringe tidbit: there's a story from a lesser-known saga about a woman named Sigrid who turned down 3 suitors in a single week. When asked why, she said, "I already have goats that listen poorly. Why would I need men to match them?" She lived to 78, died with 2 farms, 5 apprentices, and a reputation as the one woman whose cheese never molded. You're not trying to be Sigrid, but you get her, because singlehood after divorce in Viking times isn't about loneliness. It's about leverage. You've been through the storm. You know what it costs to love poorly. And now, you're choosing your peace like you choose your seeds, carefully. So when you finally sit by the fire, cup of warm meat in hand, and someone knocks at your door with the 4th offer of marriage this season, you simply say, "Come back after the harvest, if you're still interested, and if you know how to stack firewood properly, because this time, it's your terms, all of it." It's late autumn now. The air smells like smoke and wet leaves, and the sun sinks early behind the hills, turning the sky the color of old wool. You've stacked your firewood, hung dried fish above the hearth, lined your pantry shelves with jars of pickled onions, and enough honey to get you through even the moodiest winter. You're ready, not just for the cold, but for whatever comes next. And in Viking society, that means holding on to more than warmth. It means holding on to status. Because for a woman who's divorced, single, and successful, the title you carry matters almost as much as the goats you've managed to keep alive through 2 hailstorms and a minor weasel infestation. You're no longer simply a wife. You're something more complex. Are you a widow? No. Are you an ex-wife? Technically, yes, but no one uses that word in daily conversation. It sounds too modern, too flat. You're a free woman now, and that title carries weight. In Norse law, a free woman, Frialskona, had legal identity. She could make contracts, own land, bring legal claims, and be held accountable in court. She wasn't property. She owned property. There were three broad categories for women in Viking society. Unmarried, and usually under the protection of her father. Married woman, under joint household rules. Free woman or widow, no male legal guardian required. You've made it to the third one. No father, no husband, no interference. And yes, it's rare, especially in older law codes that assume male guardianship as a default, but by the time the Icelandic Sagas was compiled, there were numerous exceptions, especially for women with land, with kin, with a name that carried weight. Historians still argue how common this independence really was. Some believe most women still functioned under male protection, whether through brothers, uncles, or adult sons. Others point to saga figures who act with near complete autonomy, commanding households and making decisions without consulting a single beard in sight. But you've lived it now. The independence isn't hypothetical, it's daily. You make trade decisions, you negotiate labor, you turn down marriage offers from men who sniff too loud or claim to be descendants of Odin, but can't sharpen a blade without slicing their fingers. And society doesn't punish you for it. In fact, there's a subtle admiration that comes with your new title. At the harvest feast, your neighbors notice. You're seated among landowners, not along the benches with unmarried girls and shy cousins. The local law speaker nods at you when property disputes are raised, not because you're loud, but because you could be, and everyone knows it. One woman whispers to you near the stew pot. You remind me of Odd the deep-minded. You raise an eyebrow. That's not a casual compliment. Odd, the famous Norse matriarch, was widowed, wealthy, and sharp. She led a colonizing expedition to Iceland, claimed land in her own name, and even arranged marriages for her kin like a chess master with an excellent memory. She held her own funeral feasts, then promptly died, on her terms, with her affairs in order. You're not trying to be odd, but like Sigrid before her, you get her too, because being a free woman isn't just about land, it's about space, in your home, in your day, in your mind. You don't ask for permission to host guests. You decide when to sow barley. You light your hearth each morning and know exactly how long to leave the embers before adding wood. You don't rely on someone else to bless your routine, and maybe the most beautiful part, the quiet. No shouting in the hall, no passive-aggressive requests to fix a tunic that you sewed poorly the first time. No wondering whether you're the problem, or if he's just always that moody during the dark months. Now, when things go wrong, and they still do, it's your problem to solve, which means it gets solved, not argued over, not delayed, just handled. Fringe tidbit. Some law codes even made special note of single, landowning women who contributed to local governance. They weren't officially chieftains, but they were listened to like they were. You smile when you hear someone say, "Ask her. She'll know what to do." You're not just surviving divorce, you're thriving in the space it left behind. Because in this world, identity is layered. You've been a daughter, a wife, a woman standing in the threshold, declaring your freedom. Now, you're something else, something bigger, someone whose name is spoken with respect in households where your story is told, not as a warning, but as a path. Winter arrives without fanfare, just a slow thickening of frost on the windowsills and the quiet crunch of ice beneath your boots. The fjord freezes in glinting lines, and your goats grumble with every breath that curls from their nostrils like smoke. You've never been so busy. You're stalking wood, boiling cabbage, mending cloaks, and in between, attending to your newest duty as a landholding free woman, participating in local law gatherings, because the laws of Viking society weren't made behind palace doors. They were made out in the open, by the people, and you, as someone who owns land, pays taxes, and has legal standing, are now part of that conversation. It's called the Thing, a legal assembly that happens a few times a year. Depending on where you live, it might be a grand gathering that lasts days, or just a field-side discussion over ale and poorly salted pork. Either way, it's where disputes are settled, marriage is announced, land rights confirmed, and gossip is an unavoidable side dish. And no, you don't just attend to listen, you have voice. Not every woman had it, of course. Enslaved women did not. Married women were usually represented by their husbands or male kin. But you have full standing, because of your divorce, your property, and your persistence. You remember your first thing after the separation. You stood a little stiffly at the edge of the circle, not sure if you belonged. One man coughed awkwardly. Another woman passed you a mug and whispered, "They'll get used to it." And they did. Because Viking society, despite its bravado, made room for women who knew how to handle business. Historians still debate the limits of that space. Some argue women were rare at legal assemblies. Others point to multiple saga references where widows and free women assert claims, make formal complaints, and even act as mediators. Quirky little detail: there's a record in the Galathing law where a woman fined a neighbor for letting his pigs trample her herb garden. She not only won the case, she wrote her own claim in runes and had it delivered on a carved plank. Who needs parchment when you've got lumber? You're not there to collect fines. Not yet. But you do have an issue. A dispute over pasture land. Your neighbor insists the grazing border lies 2 trees farther into your field. You disagree. Politely at first. Less politely after he lets his sheep wander through your barley patch. So you prepare. You gather witness statements. Sketch crude maps with charcoal. Even call on your cousin, who, despite being mostly useless, is oddly good at measuring distances by stride. At the winter thing, you present your case, you speak clearly, calmly. You don't appeal to emotion, you appeal to law. And when the decision is handed down in your favor, you don't gloat. You just nod and offer the neighbor a smoked trout by way of truce. You're not trying to burn bridges. You're trying to plant hedgerows. Because being respected means understanding both power and peacemaking. And you're getting good at both. And something else happens at these gatherings. You're noticed, not just by the farmers, by the law speakers, the traders, even a few skalds who think your story might make for a fine winter tale. You become the kind of woman people talk to. Not around. And sure, some still grumble. She's too proud. She didn't need a man, but now she wants to speak like one. She probably curses her fields to grow faster. Let them. Because you've already lived through something harder than gossip. The slow, quiet erosion of a marriage, and the louder, sharper act of walking away from it. Now, you're just tending what's grown in the space that followed. You're not angling for titles or carving your name into monuments. You're maintaining what's yours, protecting your corner of the world, ensuring that next season's lambs have dry hay and the grain stores stay full. But you're also shaping the way people think about women like you. You've gone from whispered cautionary tale to something else. An example. A daughter might point and say, "She never remarried, and she still wears velvet in winter." A wife might quietly ask, "If she could leave, could I?" A skald might even say, You should hear the story of the woman who stood at the thing and won. You don't need their approval. You just need your fire to stay lit, your goats to stay fed, and your land to stay yours. And this winter, all of those things are true. Spring breaks the grip of winter like a yawn after a long silence. The ice on the fjord cracks, moaning low like a distant drum. You stand on the edge of your plot, sleeves rolled, spade in hand, the smell of thawed soil rising into the air like a promise. And with the spring thaw comes stories, yours, mostly. Because in this part of the world, sagas aren't just about kings and warriors. They're about people, what they did, why they did it, and what the neighbors thought about it 300 years later. If your story is told often enough, with enough flair, you might just become part of the great oral tradition. And your divorce, your landholding, your independence, it's perfect saga material. You're not the only one who notices. At the spring feast, the local skald, bard, takes up his harp, clears his throat, and sings a new verse about the woman who measured her own field and settled the sheep feud with silence sharper than swords. The crowd laughs in the good way, not mockery, recognition. It's not a full saga yet, just a verse, but still, you're becoming a story. And in Viking culture, stories are everything. They outlive ships, outlast buildings. They carry memory where parchment won't reach. If someone's tale is good enough, it gets repeated until it's sung across valleys and carved in runes on the backs of benches in places they never even visited. Sagas preserve the deeds of women just as they did men. Women like the deep-minded, who buried her dead with honor, carved out land in Iceland, and founded dynasties, like Gudrun Osvifsdottir, who married 4 times, outlived every man, and famously said she loved the one who never loved her back the most. A saga line still quoted in kitchens today. Historians still argue how much of these women's stories are truth and how much is bardic embroidery. But that's not the point. The point is, these women mattered. Their choices were remembered. And now, so might yours. Quirky tidbit, one preserved saga includes a woman who divorced her husband twice and married him a 3rd time, only to divorce him again. The storyteller swears she did it for property leverage and then adds, she had a laugh like a crackling fire and hands that could milk any goat. Honestly? Icon. So how does it happen, this transition from villager to verse? Well, it starts when people repeat your story, not out of spite, but fascination. It gains rhythm, detail, a little poetic license. Maybe in the first telling you left your husband after a bad harvest. In the second, it was during a thunderstorm. By the third, you carried your dowry chest on your back and told him to marry his mistress and see how she liked his cooking. You don't mind the exaggeration. Let them talk, because it's better to be spoken of than forgotten, especially when your story helps someone else see their own options more clearly. At the next market day, a younger woman approaches you near the barrel of dried herring. She doesn't say much, just nods once and presses a woven braid into your hand. It's the kind of thing a woman makes during restless nights. You recognize the pattern. You made the same one years ago when you were trying to decide whether to leave. She says, I heard what you said at the thing. You nod. I said a lot of things. She smiles. I remembered the part where you didn't raise your voice. That's how it spreads. Not always in songs, sometimes in tone. You find yourself answering more questions these days. What to do with an ill-tempered husband, how to make vinegar from crushed berries. Whether it's better to move home or start over, You don't give orders. You don't call yourself a wise woman, but people lean in when you speak. Your stead becomes a quiet stop for those who are thinking of leaving, not in panic, in planning. You offer broth. You say, "You'll need 2 witnesses." Oh, you say, "Take the spindle, leave the salt." You say, "Speak once at the threshold, then twice in the bed." Say it clearly, because stories aren't just entertainment, they're instructions, and you're living proof of how they begin. You never set out to be memorable. You just wanted peace, a warm place, a say in your life. But now, you have something more. You have your own verse, and you're still writing it, with every sheep sheared, with every legal contract signed, with every meal served in a home that is wholly, absolutely yours. They'll call you the woman who left, then they'll call you the one who thrived, and eventually, if the skalds are kind, they'll call you something even better, the one who knew what to do and did it. A new season, a new sermon. The traveling priest arrives in town with a cart full of books, a bell that rings too early, and a sharp smell of soap no one can identify. He wears black robes, frowns at butter statues of Thor, and introduces himself by declaring that God does not smile upon divorce. Well, that's going to be a problem, because Christianity has arrived, and it's not just bringing stories about miracles and fish, it's bringing rules, new rules. And for women like you, who have already walked away from a husband and dared to thrive afterward, those rules are about to become complicated. Until recently, Viking society ran on its own system, gods with personalities, laws made by consensus, honor earned in action. Marriage was a contract, and so was leaving one. But with Christianity gaining ground, marriage is suddenly a sacrament, something holy, untouchable, permanent. You hear whispers at the market. The priest has been advising chieftains. He wants to build a stone church where the old ash tree stands. He's teaching children how to make the sign of the cross, and telling women that to leave a husband is to sin. You stir your stew a little harder that night, because it's not just gossip. You felt the shift. One neighbor, a widow, confides that she's being pressured to remarry for moral structure, whatever that means. Another woman, stuck in a loveless marriage, says she asked the priest if she could leave. He frowned and handed her a prayer book. Before, you had law. Now, you're told to rely on forgiveness. Historians still argue whether this transition was swift or slow. In some regions, Christian marriage laws clamp down fast, outlawing divorce entirely or requiring formal annulments granted by bishops in distant cities. In others, Old Norse customs coexisted with Christian rites for generations, especially in rural communities where no priest dared correct a grandmother with a broom. You're lucky to live in the in-between. The priest is here, yes, but the law speaker still remembers the old codes. The thing still holds authority. The villagers still trust the woman who traded 2 cows for roofing that actually kept the snow out. But the tension grows. The priest preaches that a woman belongs first to her father, then her husband, then her God. That suffering in silence is noble, that divorce is rebellion against divine order. You wonder if he's ever tried living with someone who chews with their mouth open for 10 consecutive winters. And yet, the influence spreads. Young girls start to dream not of managing households, but of saintly patience, of martyrdom, of obedience. You see it in their lowered eyes, in the way they stop asking questions. You hear them talk about how a good woman endures. Fringe tidbit? Some early Christian missionaries tried to ban Seder, Norse magic and prophecy, because too many women were using it to influence husbands and negotiate marriages. Translation: too many women were winning. You don't practice magic, but you do know how to wield silence and timing, like weapons. And that, apparently, is suspicious enough. You're not alone, though. Other women notice. They meet at your stead more often now. The conversations turn cautious. Strategic. You begin writing down fragments of the old laws, teaching them how to phrase a separation in a way that sounds Christian enough to pass. I am no longer able to fulfill this marriage in good faith. I believe God would not ask me to endure cruelty. I am leaving to better serve my family's spiritual welfare. Translation: I'm out. Bless it or not. You keep a ledger now, not just of property and goats, but of phrases. How to say a thing without saying it. How to speak within the new system while holding on to the old truths. Because stories survive when they adapt. You meet the priest once, accidentally, at the riverbank. He asks if you've considered returning to your husband. You smile, hand him a piece of dried fish, and ask if he's considered getting married. He doesn't ask again, but his sermons get longer. And your reputation? A little sharper. She's too bold. She needs humbling. She knows the old ways too well. You wear that like a badge, because Christianity might be changing the landscape, but it hasn't yet rewritten your story. And until it does, if it ever does, you'll continue to teach women how to speak, how to leave, how to reclaim. The old gods may be quieter now, but the embers of the old laws still warm your hearth. And you're not just surviving the shift, you're navigating it. The sky darkens earlier now, and the stars come out shyly, bright points above your stead, quiet companions as you finish folding the linen and brushing the ashes from the hearth. The fields are fallow, the goats are sleepy, and you're thinking about how much has changed. Not just your life, your world. You still remember when divorce was as simple as a doorway and a loud enough voice, when the law was spoken, not written, when a woman's choices echoed across thresholds, not pulpits. And yet, traces of those old customs remain, whispers in the law rock, because even as Christianity spreads, even as the priest's sermons thicken like winter porridge and Latin creeps into the marriage vows, the bones of Norse law remain beneath it all. The customs, the habits, the collective memory. They don't vanish overnight. Some stay hidden in plain sight. Take the law rock itself. In places like Iceland's Althing, the oldest parliament in the world, laws were proclaimed aloud from a central boulder. Every summer, the law speaker recited 1/3 of the known legal code from memory. No written scrolls, just words in the wind, binding words. And among them, still, quietly, stubbornly, rules about divorce. Not as many as before, not as clearly, but they're there. You hear them, even now, in the way two women from a nearby village speak in cautious code about separating houses, in how a widow insists her late husband's cousin has no claim to her land because the gods saw us part before he died. Historians argue whether these remnants are resistance or just inertia, whether Viking women kept these traditions alive by defiance or by habit. But you don't need to argue. You can feel it. In the questions women still ask, in the way they phrase things, and in the way they watch you. Because now, you're not just the woman who divorced and survived. You're the woman who navigates the space between laws. You speak both languages, the old one of thresholds and goat counting, and the new one of forgiveness and Latin-tinged morality. and you use that bilingualism with skill. A young woman visits your stead. Her husband drinks. Too much. Sleeps all day. She wants to leave, but the priest says marriage is sacred, and her brothers agree. You ask her what she owns. Nothing. You ask her what she brought into the marriage. My grandmother's spindle, a silver clasp, a plot of barley no bigger than your porch. You nod. Then you own something. You teach her what to say. You help her count her steps. You suggest a witness or two. You teach her the old words and the new words that rhyme closely enough to pass as harmless. And when she stands outside her longhouse one rainy afternoon and declares that she will no longer share a bed with a man who forgets her name by supper, you hear the echo of your own voice, years earlier, and know that something ancient has survived. Not just the law, the will. Fringe tidbit. In parts of 14th century Scandinavia, well into the Christian era, laws still allowed for divorce under certain conditions, especially desertion and cruelty. The church grumbled, but the people remembered what had worked. Your memory is part of that now. You are walking proof that the old ways didn't vanish. They adapted. You're not clinging to the past. You're carrying it forward. You've begun carving a small board of runes in your spare time. Not a spell, not a curse, just a reminder. The old divorce formula, the one spoken at the threshold and again in the bed. You want it remembered. You want it preserved. One day, someone will find it. Maybe your daughter. Maybe her daughter. Maybe someone centuries from now, when no one remembers who Gudrun or Un were, but everyone still understands what it means to say, I am done, and I am free, because long after the priests die, and the parchment fades, and the laws are rewritten with quills instead of voices, some truths will remain, that a woman can leave, that her voice matters, that freedom isn't granted by law, it's claimed in action. So you finish the carving, you hang it near your door, and every time you walk past it, you remember the night you stood barefoot on moss, cloak over your shoulder, and said the words that saved your life. Not loud, not angry, just true. The wind is different tonight, soft and slow, like breath-warming cold hands. The fire crackles low, your cloak hangs dry near the door, and your fingers rest on the rim of your drinking horn without lifting it. You don't need to drink. Not tonight. You've lived many lives in one. Maiden, wife, divorcee, free woman, landholder, story, and now, in this quiet hour, you are still, and that's a rare thing. You remember the beginning, back when your bones were still bruised from sharing a bed you didn't want, from barren silence like a duty, from dragging a marriage behind you like a net full of wet stones. You remember the way your voice caught in your throat the first time you said, I want out. It didn't sound powerful. It just sounded true. That was enough. You remember standing on the threshold, cold underfoot, keys at your belt, belongings packed, heart thudding in your ears. The breath you took before you said it, the way the words felt when they hit the air. The neighbors looked, the goats looked, but you didn't stop. You walked, and every step since has been yours. You built a life out of cast-offs and fragments, bought land, tended soil, navigated laws like a sailor watching stars. You taught others how to leave, not with anger, not with shame, but with intention. Some didn't understand, some never will, but some did, and they will carry it forward. Your story is out there now, in jokes told at spring feasts, in whispered prayers under full moons, in verses sung by skalds who forget your name but remember your shape, a woman with wind in her cloak and fire in her eyes, stepping across a line no one thought she was allowed to cross. And now you sit in peace. The fields are ready. The house is stocked. The wind hums like a lullaby, brushing the eaves and whispering across your carved rune board. You think, maybe, it's time to sleep. Not just tonight, but truly rest. Let the world spin a while without needing your voice to steer it. Maybe you'll teach someone else to run the stead next year. Maybe you'll spend more time walking the fjord edge, letting your bare feet feel the old earth, remembering that this land was always yours, even before the dowries and disputes and sermons. Maybe, just maybe, you'll take one final journey, not a marriage, not a rebellion, just a path you choose for yourself, a place to rest, a fire to die beside, not because someone says you must, but because you decide you've done enough. You've built, you've mended, you've spoken, you've walked away, and you've walked toward something greater, freedom, dignity, peace. So when they ask, centuries from now, how Viking women lived, someone may say your name. They might remember the goats, or the sharp tongue, or the clever way you won your land back, using only a bone tally and a pot of smoked trout. They may not get the details right. That's fine. But what matters is this. They will know that you left, and you lived, and in the end, you chose. And now, with the fire low and the longhouse quiet, you let yourself sink deeper into the warmth of stillness. The goats are quiet. The fields are dark. The air outside carries no storms tonight, only the faint hush of wind weaving through branches, soft as old wool. You lie on your straw-stuffed mattress, blanket pulled to your chin, the roof beams creaking gently overhead, like the world sighing in its sleep. You don't need to be anywhere, don't need to say anything. You've already said enough. Your story isn't rushing anymore. It drifts now, slow and even, a breath in, a breath out. You feel the heaviness of your body as it settles into the bedding, your shoulders, your arms, your legs warm and slack, your fingers uncurl, your thoughts blur at the edges, not from forgetfulness, but from peace. There is no more decision to make, no doors left to close, no roads left to fear. Only the rhythm of your own breath, steady as the tide on the shore. Tomorrow may bring chores, or visitors, or nothing at all. But tonight, there's just you, whole, held, heard. So sleep now. Let the weight of the past loosen its grip. Let the sagas wait. You've done your part. You've walked your path. And now the path leads here, to rest, to dreams, to silence, to the gentle golden stillness of a woman who once left everything behind and gained the world. End of script. Sweet dreams.